From the ruins of war rose an unexpected lesson in humanity, where American soldiers who once fought Japan rebuilt its schools instead of seeking revenge. Out of devastation came trust, compassion, and a future that turned enemies into lifelong friends. September 8, 1945, Yamada Village. About 30 kilometers northwest of Tokyo, Ichiro Tanaka, 56 years old, crouched in the pitch of his family's root cellar, while his wife Ko clutched their 2 grandchildren to her chest. Above the floorboards, they could hear American trucks rolling down the dirt road that cut through the village. They had been in hiding for 3 days, surviving on pickled vegetables and cold rice. The children had stopped crying. Fear had dried their tears. Ichiro pressed his ear to the damp earthen wall and listened. His hands shook. Not from age alone. He was old enough to recall the Russo-Japanese War, not from the chill of a September morning. He trembled because he sensed what was about to happen. The Americans had arrived. For 4 years, the government radio had warned what American soldiers did: burn villages, defile shrines, show no mercy to civilians, especially the elderly who could not work, the women who could not serve, and children who were merely mouths to feed. The Imperial Army had told every village that surrender meant slavery or death. Ichiro had believed it all. Why wouldn't he? His government had never lied to him before. His son had died at Okinawa fighting those same Americans. Newspapers had carried photos of Japanese cities burning, Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka reduced to ash. Leaflets dropped from American planes promised clemency, but Ichiro trusted his own experience more. Tigers do not spare rabbits. Above them came footsteps, heavy boots on wooden boards, American voices, loud, unintelligible. Ko squeezed her eyes shut and drew the children nearer. 8-year-old Hiroshi buried his face in his grandmother's threadbare kimono. Ichiro had fought in Manchuria in 195. He had seen what conquerors did to villages, what happened to civilians who fell into enemy hands. Now, 40 years on, he feared experiencing it from the opposite side. The cellar hatch opened and light poured down the stairs. This was the ending he had imagined. What followed, though, would overturn everything he had believed about Americans. Standing at the top of the steps was Private First Class Danny O'Brien of the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, 22 from Boston, Massachusetts, who had landed in Yokohama only 8 days earlier with the occupation force. Danny noticed them at once. An old man, an old woman, 2 terrified children huddled like trapped animals in a dirt cellar. His Japanese amounted to 6 words. Theirs was no English, yet Danny could read Ichiro's face perfectly. The old man expected to die. Danny did something most army manuals probably didn't advise. He smiled. Then he raised both hands, palms showing, and backed up 2 steps slowly. He called over his shoulder conversationally to his squad leader, Sergeant Mike Kowalski. "Sarge, we've got a family down here." "Old folks and kids. They're scared stiff." Kowalski appeared at the opening, 31 from Chicago, a policeman before the war, accustomed to frightened people and knowing the look. "Tell them no one will hurt them," he instructed. Kowalski said, "Get Chen up here." Private James Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke some Japanese, came running to the cellar. In halting but clear Japanese, he called down, "Daijobu Anzenu, please come up." "You are safe." Ichiro did not move. Every instinct screamed trap. They would be coaxed out and then shot or worse. But Chen kept speaking, repeating the word for safe. At last he said something that cut through Ichiro's terror. "Kodo waika gasuta disho." The children must be hungry. That reached him because the children were indeed starving. Reluctantly, with cramped legs from 3 days crouched, Ichiro rose. He helped Ko up and lifted his grandson in his arms. Hiroshi, 8, was feather light. He hadn't had a proper meal since before the surrender. The climb up those cellar steps felt endless. With every tread, Ichiro expected the butt of a rifle to his skull and wondered if he led his family to slaughter. He came into the sunlight of his own home to find himself surrounded by American soldiers. None aimed weapons. Instead, Danny O'Brien offered a chocolate bar. Ichiro stared at it as if it might explode. "For the kids," Danny indicated, unwrapping it, breaking off a piece and putting it into his own mouth to prove it was safe. He held it out again. Hiroshi's eyes widened. "Chocolate. a thing from American magazines in another world. Japan had been at war for as long as he had lived. Sugar had been rationed since 1943. Ko glanced at Ichiro. Ichiro looked at the American's face. Danny kept smiling that easy Boston smile and extending the chocolate. Trembling, Hiroshi reached and took the piece. It was the finest taste he had ever known in his 8 years. News of that simple act spread through the village within minutes. The Americans were not slaughtering civilians or torching houses. They were giving sweets to children. By midday, 24 villagers emerged from hiding, from cellars, stalls, the woods, the shrine behind the altar, and found Rainbow Division soldiers erecting a field kitchen in the square, cooking something that smelled better than anything Yamada had tasted since 1942. Sergeant Kowalski waved them closer. "Sit down, eat. You folks look half-starved." It was army beef stew made with real meat, proper potatoes and vegetables from American supplies. For people who had been living on rice and weeds for a year, it felt like heaven. Ichiro sat on a crate holding a tin plate of stew and noticed his hands had stopped trembling. Ko sat beside him, ladling broth into their granddaughter's mouth. American soldiers ate from the same pots. One of them, a tall, red-headed private named Finnegan, sat by Ichiro and pulled a photograph from his wallet. A woman and 2 children in front of a white house with a porch. "My family," Finnegan said. Ichiro did not know the words, but he understood the meaning. This man was a father, a husband, a human being like himself. Ichiro nodded and took out his own photograph hidden in a cloth pouch, his son in an Imperial Army uniform, taken before he shipped out to Okinawa and before he died. For a long moment, the 2 old soldiers, one American, one Japanese, regarded each other across the ruins of war. Then Finnegan inclined his head slightly, a sign of respect. Over the following days, the change in Yamada Village gathered momentum, though it was not what Ichiro had expected. The Rainbow Division had been ordered to establish a presence and maintain order during the occupation, but Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the battalion commander, read those orders his own way. "We did not come here to terrorize civilians," Harrison told his officers during a briefing on their 3rd day in the village. "These people have been beaten. They are frightened. They are hungry. They have been lied to about us for years. Our mission is to show them what America really stands for." What Harrison saw in Yamada stunned him. The village school, a small wooden building where 60 children once learned, had been partly destroyed in an American bombing 6 months earlier. Roof collapsed, walls charred. Since then, the children had had no schooling, no materials to rebuild, barely enough to eat. Teachers had fled. Books had burned. The future for Yamada's children seemed to be endless rice paddies and back-breaking poverty. Harrison made a choice beyond his orders. He asked Sergeant Kowalski, "Mike, how many carpenters do we have in the battalion? Men who can frame walls, lay floors, fix roofs?" Kowalski considered. "Maybe a dozen, sir. Lots of farm boys who know their way around a hammer." "Good. Round them up. We're rebuilding that school." Private Danny O'Brien had done construction work in Boston before the war, summers helping his uncle frame houses in Suey. He never expected those skills to matter in the Army. He had spent the war digging foxholes, carrying ammunition, trying to survive. Now he measured lumber, cut boards, and a group of Japanese men watched him with bewilderment. Chen translated, "They want to know why you are doing this." Danny looked up from his saw. "Doing what?" "Building their school. They don't understand why American soldiers would rebuild a Japanese school." Danny thought of his sister, a 3rd-grade teacher back home who always said education was everything. Without it, kids had no future. "Tell them," he said slowly, "kids need a place to learn. Japanese kids, American kids, it doesn't matter. Kids are kids," Chen translated. The Japanese men exchanged glances. One of them, a younger man named Satoshi, who had survived Manuria and somehow returned home, stepped forward and, through Chen, said, "We will help." And they did. What unfolded in Yamada over the next 6 weeks mirrored events in hundreds of occupied villages, yet each place had its own character and human moments. In Yamada, those moments came quickly. Ichiro Tanaka, the old man who had hidden in his cellar expecting death, became an informal bridge between villagers and Americans. He had once been a school teacher decades earlier before being drafted for the Russo-Japanese War. Now he watched American soldiers and Japanese laborers rebuilding the school where he had taught. The Americans brought more than lumber and nails. They brought laughter. Private Finnegan, the red-headed father of two, started a baseball game during a break, finding a stick and a ball made of wrapped cloth and teaching 8-year-old Hiroshi how to swing. "Like this, kid, keep your eye on the ball." That's it. Hiroshi didn't know English, but he understood baseball. By the second week, daily games filled the village square, American and Japanese children playing together. Older villagers stopped and struggled to process what they saw, the enemy playing with their youngsters. Sergeant Kowalski found himself showing basic carpentry to teenage boys who had been trained to die in a final suicidal defense of the homeland. Now they learned to build rather than destroy. Measure twice, cut once, drive a straight nail. One of them, 16-year-old Kenji, who had learned some English from a missionary teacher before the war, asked the question every villager wanted answered. "Why do you do this?" "We were your enemy." "We fought you." "Why help us now?" Kowalski set down his hammer. "War's over, kid. You lost, but that doesn't mean you have to stay beaten. My grandmother came to America from Poland with nothing. People helped her. Now I'm helping you. That's how it works." He did not pretend the deaths hadn't happened. Many good men died on both sides, but the war was over, and now they would build. The school took 6 weeks to reconstruct. During that time, countless small acts of humanity added up to something larger. Example 1, the rice shortage. 3 weeks into the rebuild, the village ran out of rice. The harvest had failed, and government supplies had dried up amid the chaos after surrender. Families began skipping meals so their children could eat. When Lieutenant Colonel Harrison learned this, he diverted a truckload of army rice to the village, enough for 2 months. The village elder, a 70-year-old named Yamada, bowed until his forehead nearly touched the ground and, through tears, said in broken English, "We do not deserve your kindness." Harrison's reply, relayed by Chen, was simple. "Every child deserves to eat." "That is not kindness. That is human decency." Example 2, the teacher's return. As the school neared completion, Ichiro asked Kowalski for help locating the village's former teacher, Yuki Nakamura, who had fled to Tokyo during the bombings. Corporal Robert Martinez found her in a refugee shelter, teaching children in a bombed-out basement with charcoal on scraps of wood. "We rebuilt your school," Martinez told her through an interpreter. "The kids need you." Yuki Nakamura came back to Yamada and wept when she saw the new building. The Americans had not only rebuilt it, but improved it. New desks from army supplies, books collected by a chaplain, a fresh chalkboard, windows that opened properly. On the wall, a mural painted by Private Danny O'Brien, who had studied art before the war, showed Japanese and American children playing beneath a rainbow, the Rainbow Division's emblem made into hope. Example 3. The dedication on October 20th, 1945 marked the school's formal reopening. 60 children sat on newly made wooden benches wearing neat uniforms the village had managed to cobble together. Parents lined the walls while American soldiers stood at the rear, caps on. Ichiro Tanaka, the old man who had hidden in his root cellar 6 weeks earlier, was asked to speak with Chen translating. He said that for 4 years their government had painted Americans as devils who would murder, enslave, and destroy them. He confessed he had believed those lies and, when he heard American trucks, had buried his family underground like rabbits awaiting death. His voice cracked as he finished. Instead, they fed our children, rebuilt our school, and revealed that the real wickedness was the falsehood itself. They had given the children a future for which Japanese had no adequate words, only goas. "Thank you." Private Danny O'Brien felt something in his eye, likely sawdust, certainly not tears. Sergeant Kowalski didn't bother hiding his emotion. The big ex-Chicago cop stood openly weeping. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison presented both an American and a Japanese flag to fly together, saying through Chen that the flags symbolized a war-torn past, while the school embodied a future where foes could become friends. Soldiers could become builders, and children could learn in peace. He framed this as the purpose of America's fight, not conquest but liberation, not destruction but reconstruction. The ceremony closed with the children singing the Japanese anthem and, haltingly and a little out of tune, "You are my sunshine," which Finnegan had taught them. Afterwards, 8-year-old Hiroshi sprinted to Danny O'Brien and wrapped his arms around the American's legs, no interpreter needed. What unfolded in Yamada was the result of deliberate policy. Even before landing in Japan, General Douglas MacArthur had ordered occupation forces to act not as vengeful conquerors, but as victors offering peace. Every compassionate gesture toward Japanese civilians was intended to undercut militarist propaganda. This was both principle and tactic. American leaders such as Eisenhower and Marshall believed that humane treatment of the defeated was essential to winning the peace. And U.S. practice went well beyond legal obligations like the Geneva Conventions. It rested on a conviction that every person had inherent dignity, regardless of which side they had fought on. That stance contrasted sharply with Axis conduct. Japanese POW camps in China and the Pacific experienced mortality rates up to 40%. German POWs in Soviet hands suffered similarly. Rebuilding an enemy's school would have seemed unthinkable to most victors. Yet many American troops came from immigrant families who remembered being helped in hard times. Kowalski's Polish grandmother, O'Brien's Irish grandfather who escaped the potato famine, Martinez's Mexican relatives who crossed for opportunity, so acts of aid felt familiar. For Ichiro and Yamada's villagers, 6 weeks of rebuilding shattered their assumptions about Americans. In a diary later found, Ichiro recorded the shock. On September 8th, the Americans arrived and they awaited death. By September 15th, they had been fed. By September 22nd, they were building a school. On October 20th, he wept at the reopening, having rediscovered hope and concluding that these Americans were not conquerors but teachers showing a way to live without war. Yuki Nakamura, the teacher traced back from Tokyo, wrote that the soldiers who had rebuilt the school were just young men, farm boys and city boys, who stayed to work because they believed Japanese children deserved a future. She vowed to spend her life trying to be worthy of that mercy. This change in outlook was not confined to Yamada. Across Japan, millions who had been taught to fear Americans found a very different reality. By December 1945, occupation forces had repaired or rebuilt over 2,000 schools, distributed vast quantities of food to avert famine, and delivered medical care to hundreds of thousands. Japanese civilian mortality actually declined during the first year of occupation as U.S. doctors treated patients and engineers, restored water and power systems. Soldiers routinely shared rations with hungry children. By contrast, Japanese occupations in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia caused millions of civilian deaths through brutality and forced labor. German and Soviet occupations produced similar devastation elsewhere. The American occupation of Japan was imperfect and included crimes and mistakes, but its prevailing pattern was one of reconstruction rather than reprisal. That approach was also pragmatic geopolitics. MacArthur and his staff recognized they needed a stable, democratic Japan rather than a resentful rump that might spawn future wars. Their judgment proved prescient. Within 10 years, Japan recovered into an economic powerhouse. Within 2 decades, it became one of America's closest allies. The children who attended the rebuilt school in Yamada grew into participants in Japan's post-war recovery, and many never forgot the soldiers who showed them compassion. Ichiro lived to 87 and returned to teaching in the very school Americans had rebuilt. He kept up a correspondence with Sergeant Kowalski for 35 years until Kowalski's death in 1980. In 1985, Ichiro told a reporter that what he remembered most was Danny. O'Brien's smile and the way that chocolate bar had said, "You are human and so am I." That smile, he said, saved his soul. Hiroshi, the cellar boy who tasted chocolate and learned baseball, became an English teacher who introduced generations of Japanese students to American culture and kindness. In 1995, he visited Boston and met Danny, now retired from construction, and thanked him in perfect English. Danny replied that Hiroshi had taught him the same lesson. Yuki Nakamura taught for 43 years in the rebuilt school. When she retired in 1988, the village installed a plaque recording that the school had been rebuilt in 1945 by soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, together with the people of Yamata Village to build peace from ruin. The Yamata story is only one among thousands. Multiply similar efforts across Japan and Europe under the Marshall Plan, and a pattern emerges. Instead of imposing crushing reparations as after World War I, which helped precipitate another war, America invested billions to rebuild economies. These were strategic investments as much as they were expressions of values. The children fed, schooled, and treated by American personnel grew into leaders of democratic, prosperous nations that became key U.S. allies during the Cold War and after. Germany, Italy, and Japan moved from bitter foes to long-term partners. This outcome was not accidental. It reflected choices by individuals like Danny O'Brien, Mike Kowalski, and Jim Finnegan, and by leaders such as MacArthur and Eisenhower, who grasped that how you treat defeated people shapes the lasting peace. In 2015, a Japanese television crew found the Yamata School still standing, maintained and renovated, and still teaching. Behind protective glass hung the mural Danny had painted 70 years earlier of Japanese and American children under a rainbow. A 93-year-old woman who had been 12 when the school reopened said she owed her whole life, children, grandchildren, a good old age, to the education she received there and would die grateful. In Boston, just before his death at 95 in 2018, Danny O'Brien told his great-granddaughter that what he was proudest of was the little wooden school he had helped rebuild in 1945 because it gave children a future. The Yamata lesson is straightforward. War does not have to end in vengeance, and enemies need not remain enemies forever. Breaking cycles of violence requires deliberate choices, acts of kindness that may seem irrational in the moment. But those choices can win the peace. Soldiers who had just fought a devastating war spent 6 weeks rebuilding a school and sharing food because they implicitly understood that true victory is not only battlefield success but securing a durable peace in which former foes become partners. Ichiro expected death and found humanity. Hiroshi expected cruelty and found chocolate, baseball, and teachers. Yuki Nakamura expected ruin and found a better school. These outcomes were choices. America might have chosen revenge or exploitation, but instead it chose reconstruction and investment, demonstrating that democracy entails respecting the dignity of all people, even enemies. That policy paid lasting dividends. Former adversaries became reliable allies, and the children educated in rebuilt schools became leaders of free societies. The peace achieved after 1945 was strengthened by persistent acts of decency rather than continued violence. What happened in Yamata Village in 1945 still matters. In a world of ongoing conflicts, terrorism, and entrenched wars, the simple story of soldiers rebuilding a school remains relevant. How you treat your enemies determines what happens once the shooting stops. You can create more enemies, or you can open the door to peace. The Rainbow Division left Yamata Village more than a building. They left hope, a future, and proof that even after the darkest war, people can choose to rebuild humanity. Do you have a family story about the American occupation of Japan or Germany? Did your grandparents or great-grandparents experience former enemies becoming friends? Share their memories. Next, the German POW who expected torture at Camp Concordia, Kansas, but instead learned to love baseball, Johnny Cash, and American Pie, and returned